Hello friends, and welcome back to my second channel. I wasn't planning on coming back so soon, but I've read a lot of really good books lately that I wanted to chat about, and I asked you guys on Instagram if you'd like to see a reading wrap up for the month of May, and 100%, I wasn't expecting that, but 100% of you said yes. So here we are. So first let's talk about some stats. So for the month of May 2021, I read 14 books for a total of about 3,400 pages. And I've just been doing full star ratings, not half star ratings, so my average was 3.36. All these stats I'm getting straight off the story graph because they give you pretty graphs, which is great. I actually did pretty well in terms of length of book. Normally I definitely skew towards shorter books. I did still read a lot of under 300 pages, but I actually read by a smidgen more in the 300 to 500 page category. None over 500 pages though. I'm still terrified of big books. I read about 2/3 fiction and 1/3 non-fiction. I love this graph that the story graph give you. This is the moods of the books, and I tended to gravitate towards reflective, emotional and informative books. And I also tend to prefer slower and medium paced books, which is again reflected here. My most read genres for the month were contemporary by quite a margin, memoir, historical and essays. Also, it was a bit of a weird month in terms of my ratings. I gave no 3 stars, so I definitely felt like I either really disliked books or I really enjoyed them. There wasn't so much middle ground this month, which was unusual. I had 1 star. It's very rare that I give a 1 star, but we'll talk about it. 5 2 stars, which is a lot. And then I had 4 books each for 4 and 5 stars. So let's start by talking about the 1 star book. This was Now That I See You by Emma Batchelor, and it is a brand new release here in Australia, and it's sort of dubbed autofiction. So it's very much based on Emma's experience, but she must have taken some fictional license, I suppose. And it is basically her journal, although it does also include some letters and other elements, over a year period in her life, starting around the moment when her long-term partner tells her that they are trans. And I picked this up partly because I like the cover, partly because I'm interested in the topic, and also because it's just won quite a big award here in Australia too. So I had fairly high hopes for this one. I don't have it here to show you because I've already gotten rid of it. That's how much I disliked this, and I feel really bad, especially for a young debut author, kind of trashing on it. But at the same time, I'm not trans, I don't have that experience, but I did feel like this was kind of offensive. To me, it read very much like Emma really centered herself in this experience of her partner coming out as trans. And I get that it's a journal, so inherently, it is her words, her internal experience. And I know that she also didn't want to put words in Jesse's mouth. But what I mean by that is how she processed everything. It really came back to how she was feeling. And even when she detailed interactions that she would have with Jesse, she was sort of telling it as if we, the reader, should be on her side, but I was just sort of shocked by how toxic her behavior was. And the further I got along in the book, the more uncomfortable I became. It started with things like her just being a bit shocked or uncomfortable or uncertain about, what Jesse's identity meant for their relationship, which I get that uncertainty. Like when Jesse at the beginning first starts talking about the possibility of trying hormone therapy, Emma gets quite angry because in her mind, a dress is one thing because you can take that off, whereas hormone therapy is permanent. There's also just a running theme throughout the whole book that Jesse deceived Emma by not coming out as trans sooner. And there's no sort of reflection on how that's kind of transphobic. Also, when Emma was particularly upset or mad about something, she would revert to using Jesse's incorrect pronouns. And about midway through the book, Jesse sort of expresses that they're finding Emma's response a little difficult, but that one of their best friends they're finding is really supportive. So Emma decides to go and meet this best friend to tell them her side of the story. And Jesse clearly wants some space in exploring their identity and sort of getting to know themselves and what this means for them in the relationship. And when they express that need and that desire, Emma sort of gets quite controlling and demands a certain amount of time together each week. Her argument is that she just loves Jesse so much and, she needs to wean off them or transition to friendship. And so therefore, they have to go through this process that makes it easier for Emma. But to me, that just read as borderline emotional abuse. I don't know. I found this whole book so uncomfortable, and the way that people are sort of celebrating it as if it's this amazing story about trans identity and love. And I didn't get that at all. Now for the 2-star books. I finally got around to reading another Ishiguro. I read The Buried Giant. I found this one at a secondhand bookshop and I was super excited. Essentially, this is a historical fiction with sort of like a speculative fantasy twist. It's set in post-Arthurian Britain, which I think is a really interesting setting. And it follows this elderly couple who are sort of going on a trip to try and meet their son, their grown-up son, who they haven't seen in a long time. There's quite a bit of tension between the different people that live in the area, but ultimately the sort of like interesting element of the book is that everybody just sort of forgets stuff. Not everything, but a lot of things. So it's a little bit of a mystery. They want to figure out why everybody keeps forgetting things. They also meet Sir Gawain along the way, which is kind of cool. I think it's one of those funny things where like the concept of the book is really interesting and compelling, but it just sort of doesn't translate very well into an actual story and narrative. And if anything, perhaps the concept sort of works against the storytelling element, because the whole point is that they sort of forget stuff, which means that in order to convey how forgetful they are, it becomes very repetitive. And because these characters don't remember a lot about their history, they also feel really two-dimensional. It was a 350-page book, but it felt so much longer. So I sort of like the idea, although I'm not sure that I love the conclusion drawn. The reading experience wasn't a great one. Then the next is a book that I actually do still have on me. It is Baby by Annalise Jochums, I'm not sure. This is a New Zealand book that I picked up partly because the cover intrigued me, I'm not gonna lie. And it's sort of touted as being funny, sexy, unnerving, dangerous, thrilling, deliciously funny. I don't know that it really did many of those things very well, at least for me. I will say though that this was probably one of the hardest for me to rate because it was just really, it was really fucking weird. I really liked the voice of the author. I loved how we sort of got this really like pinpoint focus on mundane things. And I also just felt like it had a very quintessentially millennial tone to it. A lot of reviewers on GoodReads were talking about the different themes that they picked up, about like consumer culture and even reality TV. I didn't really get those from my reading of it. We basically follow this young woman, I can't even remember her name at this point, who sort of is like just a bit odd, I guess, and she has a crush on her like fitness teacher. They end up sort of running away together and buying a boat and then living on a boat, but then stuff gets weird. If I had to pick like an interesting, I don't know, theme that I would draw from the book, to me it definitely felt like what happens when, you know, privileged people sort of run away from their idea of normal to try and find some idealized fantasy happy ending, you know, away from society, away from their problems, because ultimately your problems follow you. And in this book, those problems were very much exaggerated and came to the forefront because of the claustrophobic setting of the boat. And I have to say, I was really enjoying the first half, but for all its strangeness and intensity, it just sort of felt like it dragged on for the second half. Even though the second half just sort of got weirder and weirder, I don't know, it didn't really take me along for the emotional journey, I guess. I think I also just didn't find it as shocking as I was supposed to. I'm not sure. It just didn't have a big impact for me. That's almost the worst thing a book can do for me, is to make me feel nothing. And this book sort of did. Next, I read The Octopus and I by Erin Hortle. And this is an Australian novel that was released a couple of years ago and I've had on my shelf for at least a year. I've been really excited about reading this book, but I've already gotten rid of it because I didn't enjoy it. This was about a woman who had breast cancer, and it's sort of set after she's finished her treatment and everything. I really enjoyed the exploration in the book about this woman owning her own body after such a traumatic experience, and also of deciding, you know, whether to get breast implants or not, and, you know, sort of what that meant and who she'd be getting them for and all of that sort of stuff. I thought that was really, really well tackled. But the further I got along, the sort of, especially the ending, I just found so unsatisfying. There's a big element of sort of like environmentalism versus, you know, traditional use of the land. And when I say traditional, I don't mean like Aboriginal use of the land. It was more framed like, you know, do-gooders and greenies and environmentalists versus the true locals. And I sort of thought it was like an interesting take on that. Ultimately, I feel like the ending and the way specifically that some of the characters responded to the events, it felt very like narratively convenient. Ultimately, it sort of ended up demonizing a character who I thought brought an interesting perspective to the question that I thought the book was asking of the reader. And so it just sort of felt like a bit of a cop-out. And I just was left feeling very unsatisfied. The next of the 2 stars was Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason, another Australian book, another one I've been really looking forward to. And honestly, this book has such good reviews on Goodreads. It has a 4.18 average rating of like thousands of reviews, which is really hard to do. And oh my gosh, I would have DNF'd this so many times, except one of my really good friends at work was also reading it, and she was struggling too, but we sort of wanted to finish it together so that we could talk about it, I guess. This is the story of a woman and her life and her relationships, and she also has sort of complex mental health issues, which we don't get a name for, but they very much influence her and her life and her experiences. It's also about motherhood, not wanting to be a mother, wanting to be a mother, and sort of how that can tie into an experience of mental health and trauma. For a book that is called Sorrow and Bliss, I was expecting truly a roller coaster ride of emotions throughout this book, and instead it was very one note. It did not take me on some kind of emotional journey. It just sort of slogged along for me. And I was aware going into this that it being a story about mental illness, that I could feel some type of way about the representation of that. But that is not why I decided to rate this quite low. It honestly was because this book was boring. I found it boring. It was supposed to be funny as well as sad. I didn't really find the humor in it at all. And I just was never emotionally invested in any of the characters. There's a lot of content warnings for this book, and I did actually write a reasonably long review, at least for me, over on Goodreads. But that book took me 10 days to read, and I'm just tired of it, so I don't want to talk about it anymore. Let's move on. As I said, I had no 3-star reads for this month, so we're going to jump straight up to 4 stars. So there's going to be a big tone shift in this video from now. The first of the 4 stars was The Coconut Children by Vivian Pham. This is another Australian debut, although it is a couple of years old. And from what I understand, Vivian Pham wrote this when she was like 17 or something. This book is set in the 1990s here in Australia in a town called Cabramatta, and it is focused mainly on a Vietnamese immigrant community. In particular, Sunny, who is the daughter of one Vietnamese immigrant couple, and Vince, who's sort of their neighbor. So this book deals with a hell of a lot. It deals with intergenerational trauma, it deals with racism, it deals with sexual assault and abuse and difficult home lives. It also deals with like drug and gang culture. It really explores concepts of community, belonging, identity, love. This is like, it's just such an incredible book, and especially for how young this author was, like 16 or 17. I just kind of can't get over how good it is. I know this book isn't for everybody, and some people didn't enjoy the writing. I loved it. I thought it felt really unique, very confident, really strong, and I sunk into these characters. They come off the page like characters I haven't read in a long time. I know that some people also didn't like sort of like how dramatic some of these characters were, but for me, I feel like the author really captured the sort of the big emotions that come with being a teenager, like the angst and the lust and all of it. I thought she expressed that really well through these characters, but in a way that didn't feel like it was a YA novel, which I don't always love personally. It still felt like a really grown-up adult sort of look at all of these really difficult themes. And also there's just some really great quotes in this book that I noted down, and I want to read them to you. It didn't matter that they were dead. Some corpses can never decompose. Some moments hurt so much they can't ever be lost. Could you go on loving someone without ever learning to forgive them? She supposed that that was the single misfortune of all lullabies. You are safe in your sleep, and yet the world is always there, waiting for you to wake up. So I'm so glad I finally picked this book up. This is one that I'd sort of been thinking about getting for a long time, but eventually I found it secondhand and like couldn't not, and I was thrilled. These next 3 books I literally read back to back, so let's do them in order. The first was Emotional Female by Yumiko Kadota. This book is an Australian book. It's a non-fiction though this time, and it has gotten a lot of hype here in Australia this year, and I think with really good reason. Yumiko was every Asian parent's dream. Model student, top of her class in medical school, and on track to becoming a surgeon. A self-confessed workaholic, she regularly put knife before life. This is Yumiko's experience of growing up. I think she lived in Japan, Singapore, the UK, and then in Australia, from memory. I hope I got all those right. She then goes to university and then ends up working as a doctor, and she wants to ultimately go into plastic surgery. She loves it. She has a great passion for it, but she comes up against so much just problematic toxic behavior in the industry. Some of it's just like inherent, this like workaholic kind of burnout kind of culture where she was pushed to the edge and not really offered much support or help. But she also experiences a lot of racism, microaggression, sexism, It's just really pervasive, and it ends up burning her out, and it sucks. This was such an easy book to read. I think I read it in 2 days, and for, you know, quite a long book. I thought it was going to be more dense. That's not to say it's not difficult to read in terms of like the emotional impact. It sucks what she goes through. It's really frustrating and sad that this is, you know, what we often say, it's still happening today. I can't believe this is still happening today. But of course it is. And just reading about her direct experience and how brave she was to put it on the page, knowing, you know, the sort of impact that would have on any future career she wanted in this field. And I think because her personality comes across so strongly as someone who's really driven and focused and proactive, even when we're in the really, really dark, hard parts of the book, I don't know, it never feels sort of like bogged down in a hopelessness, even when there are elements of hopelessness to her experience. I don't know, she just has such like this strong conviction, I suppose, which really comes across, and it's wonderful to read. Next was Swallow the Air by Tara June Winch. Tara June Winch in 2019 released probably one of my favourite books and one of the biggest books in Australia that year, The Yield. And this was her previous book. So I think this is like 10 or 12 years old now from memory. I think this might have been her debut actually, which is kind of incredible. I've been wanting to get to Tara June Winch's back catalogue since I read The Yield because I loved it so much. And I'm finally getting to this one. It is a lot shorter, and it reads a little bit more like a YA than an adult, or it definitely focuses on younger people anyway. It's about these 2 young kids, May and Billy, and their mother dies early on in the book, and then they have to go live with their auntie. And May, they sort of end up quite disconnected from each other, from their sense of home and belonging, and go off looking for those things in other people and in other places. I found the first half of this book a little slow, if I'm being honest, and that's probably why it wasn't like as successful for me as The Yield. Also, The Yield just sort of felt like it was a grander sort of project. This more felt like a bit of a smaller story, even though it tackled really big, important themes. That first half wasn't quite as compelling as I was hoping it would be. But the final, like 3 or so, 4 chapters, the final half of this was so good. I really, really loved them. If you've read The Yield, you'll know that Tara June Winch has such a readable but quite unique writing style. To me, I don't know, you can just tell it's Tara June Winch as soon as you start reading it, and that is definitely alive and well here. And of course, her exploration of things like belonging, family, identity, just beautiful. So I'm really glad that I got to read this, and I think she has another 1 or 2 books, so I'll be getting to those eventually soon too. Then immediately after that, I read Anita Heiss's new book, Biliyara Dungalungdarai, which translates to River of Dreams. This is a new release this year, even I think last month, and it is getting a lot of hype, which I'm very, very happy about. Also, I love this, like, I don't know if you can see, it's sort of like embossed and glossy. This beautiful goanna in the stars. It's so pretty. Anita Heiss is a pretty well-known author here in Australia. I've never read any of her books before this one. I really, really loved this one. I said on my other channel that like the first half, 3/4 of this book like are borderline perfection in my view. Just how well she gets like the pacing, the intensity, the emotional impact. She covers so many incredible themes from like the Aboriginal experience of early settlement, what that looked like, the servitude, the Masters and Servants Act and how that influenced people, the experience of belonging and family, and then the disconnection from those things. Also, it's an incredible romance. Like, oh, she just hits on so many wonderful, wonderful beats in this book that it just comes together to form such an amazing reading experience. I could not put this book down. She also covers really interesting topics about racism experienced in this time in particular, but that we can reflect on today. The one that really stood out to me was in particular the white saviorism, the sort of like good white person idea of herself that the main white female character had, how she very much wanted to help the Aboriginal people in the community, and yet she was exploiting her friendship with Wogadine, the main character, and the way that she treated Wogadine was not as an equal, even if she kept telling Wogadine that she was treating her as an equal and a friend. It was an interesting dynamic, and I think Anita Heiss offered Louisa, this white character, like she was quite generous in how she depicted her and her nuance. She really allowed her to be a full character, even if she was kind of exploring some of these themes through her. So it was just brilliant. The only thing that sort of let this down a little bit, and this is definitely more a 4.5 than a 4-star read, you know what I mean, was that I do feel like the last quarter, maybe not even that, just felt quite rushed. Ultimately, I wanted more time with these characters, and I didn't feel like the ending I don't know, allowed us enough time to breathe and to experience that conclusion with them. So that's the only criticism I have. The rest of this book is wonderful. The other thing that I loved about this was how much Wiradjuri language was included throughout. Because we have a whole cast of Aboriginal characters here, and they have a lot of conversation with each other, they use their language quite a lot. And so we as readers get to experience that. And it fits into the narrative so well. There is a glossary at the back that you can refer to if you ever forget. But it's done in such a way that I very, very rarely felt the need to. Like it made sense, it flowed, it was wonderful. I really hope this does well in Australia this year and hopefully internationally too. I hope she wins a lot of awards because it's well deserved. Then finally, my 5-star books. First is this sweet little book that I picked up entirely on a whim by the author Shinsuke Yoshitake. This is a sweet little graphic novel all about books and bookstores and libraries and people who love books. I don't know, it's sort of a book about nothing and yet everything all at once. I literally read this in half an hour, so there's not a whole lot that I can say. It's sort of something that you just have to experience. And if you love books and you ever see this, I definitely encourage you to pick it up because it's wonderful. It's just one of those things that's so cute and so sweet and wholesome and charming that you just sort of like, the whole time. That's how I felt anyway. That is an emotion. That's a real thing, right? And then finally, The Saturday Portraits by Maxine Beneba Clark. Maxine Beneba Clark is one of my favourite Australian authors, and as far as I know, she still does live somewhere around me, and I love her. Foreign Soil is one of my favourite books of all time. That's a collection of her short stories. This, however, is a non-fiction work where she basically, for the Saturday paper, would cover different famous people or sometimes particular topics, and in about 1,000 words sort of explore them. But she was encouraged and sought out because she's a creative writer. So these aren't written as sort of like, you know, those classic journalistic bios where they give you like a factual rundown. They very much come across as creative writing pieces. What I also really like about these is that Maxine, like, she becomes a character, or not a character, but like who she is integral to how she portrays and pitches these people. So in that way, it sort of reads as a cohesive whole too, because we get pieces of her throughout the book as well and how she changes over time. Because as a Black woman in Australia, she has a particular perspective, and that is important and relevant to the way that she interacts with these often famous, important people, and to the idea of them and to how they're represented or perceived in Australian culture. So rather than trying to be objective, she really leans into the subjectivity of it all. And it's just beautifully done. I adore her writing. I love her perspective. I just find her so sort of poignant and specific, but also really tender. I love her. I loved this. I read it in a day. I couldn't put it down. And it was wonderful. Hi, Editing Katie here, and I've just realised I'm nearly finished editing this video. I was excited to get it out to you, but I forgot to talk about the last 2 books. So, you're getting me bright and early in the morning, looking like this, to talk about my other 2 5-star books. So I read Act Your Age, Eve Brown, which is the 3rd and final instalment of the Brown sisters. I read this on my Kindle while I was in Bateman's Bay, and it was really good. I've really loved this whole series. I'm not a huge romance reader. I'm not like an anti-romance reader or anything. I enjoy a good romance every now and then, and I find them nice to read in between like heavy books and stuff. But the Brown Sisters trilogy has probably been like the best time I've had in romance reading, like ever. And although I would much rather the series just not end, I am very happy with the way that it has ended. This one felt slightly more of a slow burn than the other 2 did, although it has been a while since I read those, so I could just be misremembering. But this one just felt like we really got to spend some time with these characters getting to know each other, and it suited them and their personalities really well. This was just outright adorable and so sweet and also really hot. So I had a good time. And our final book, I listened to this on audio, and I did get the audiobook via Libro FM's ALC program, so thank you Libro FM. I do quite like the Green Brothers. I haven't like consumed everything they've ever released, but I watch their videos sometimes, and like I have done for like at least 10 years, probably longer. So I sort of knew going in that I was going to enjoy this book, but oh my god. I mean, John has a way of making everything emotional, and he very often sort of explores ideas around like mental illness and consciousness and sense of self, and also just like our place in the world and mortality and those sort of topics really do a lot for me. And in particular, the way John approaches these sort of topics, I find really relatable, but also very validating and inspiring, and ultimately hopeful. Because even though I think he and I share this quality where I think he can tend to be like automatically on the pessimistic side of things, he's always striving to find meaning and hope in things, which I just find really beautiful and inspiring, like I said. And in this book, he does a lot of that. It sort of is a memoir in a lot of ways. It's chronological in terms of like the storytelling of John's life, and we follow him from, childhood up to, meeting his wife and his experiences with mental illness and becoming a father and the whole thing. But in between all of that, he's also discussing different elements of the modern world, and he's reviewing them on a 5-star scale. So it's really quite funny. It's also just very interesting. I felt like I learnt a lot of interesting things about the world. But then I also learnt a lot about John and how he sees the world, and also how he's choosing or wanting to see the world. And all that mixed together made me feel like I learnt more about my place in the world as well. And I cried a lot. And I definitely would recommend the audiobook. It's wonderful. It's read by John. So I think through the audiobook, you definitely get to experience the book in a way that really honours its roots in the podcast. So those are the other 2 books I read. We're done now. So you can go back to good lighting, good camera, and dressed Katey. So those are the 14 books I read in the month of May. A weird month in terms of reading, because I either really didn't like or really did like all of the books I read. No middle ground, no neutral here. So thank you to those of you who said that you were interested in this. I always love talking about books. You know that about me by now. Let me know what you've been reading recently, anything that you'd recommend, and I'll talk to you in the comments and hopefully in another video soon. So much love. Bye.